Hi, my name is Sergey Radchenko, and I wanted to do a video review of a book. Why? Obviously, because nobody asked me to. So here's the book. The book is by Mikhail Zygar. It is called, it's in Russian. I think there is an English version. It's called War and Punishment: How Russia Destroyed Ukraine. Published just this year. Now, Zygar is a very prominent commentator on Russian affairs, prominent journalist. I have read other books by him. I've enjoyed them greatly, and this book is also to be enjoyed. It's a wonderful book that just reads like a novel. So I highly commend this book to you. But there are a few things that I wanted to say about it, and I apologize. My notes are on a Scandinavian Airlines puke bag. That's just because I was writing them on the flight, and I had nothing else. By the way, a note for airlines: do not make your puke bags in dark color because it's very hard to see if you write stuff on them. So, what is it that I will talk about here? What are the interesting bits in this book? First of all, the book basically is it sort of covers a history of Russia-Ukraine interaction over centuries, and it intersperses history and the present. So it talks about historical events, but also talks about the run-up to the war against Ukraine. Talks about Putin quite a lot, and some of those bits, anecdotes, many of them based on interviews, I found extremely enlightening. For example, the book talks about Putin's desire for respect, how Putin wanted respect. I'll give you a couple of quotes here. Putin was really keen, argues Zygar, to conduct a new Yalta, a throwback here to the February 1945 conference. And I'm translating, so apologize for kind of simultaneous not simultaneous, but immediate translation. Obviously, it's perhaps not a very accurate translation. But during his rule, he continued to dream about conducting a new Yalta, which would confirm that he's respected and he's considered a key world player. But this never happened, and this encouraged Putin towards military adventures. So that is one interesting quote. There's another one here, where he talks about how Putin realized after his Munich conference speech in 2007, that anti-American rhetoric was what brought him recognition. He says, universal recognition came to Putin not because of some achievements, but exclusively because of his anti-American rhetoric. And I think Zygar is right. Actually, I talk about this, Putin striving for recognition, in my new book, To Run the World, which really traces this whole Soviet desire, the Kremlin's desire, ultimately Russia's desire for recognition from 1945 all the way to the present. So I think we're on the same wavelength here. So I found that bit interesting. What else? Another interesting bit here is the way that Zygar discusses the Minsk agreements. Of course, we know the agreements of 2014-2015 were never implemented, and to this day, both sides accuse the other of not implementing Minsk agreements. It seems that Zygar is inclined more towards Ukraine not carrying out Minsk agreements. He basically says here that during the meeting between Putin and Zelensky at the end of 2019, Putin insisted on the implementation of Minsk agreements, but Zelensky simply could not do it because he understood that the provisions of the Minsk agreements that would guarantee autonomy for eastern part of Ukraine would simply not be accepted by the Ukrainian society, and Putin took that very personally. He felt that this was a sort of a case of Ukrainians screwing him. He emphasizes that they try to screw Putin And then he talks about, and here Zygar criticizes Poroshenko in a sense, because it was President Poroshenko, who signed the Minsk agreements. And basically he says, well, Poroshenko signed the Minsk agreements, but then unleashed a campaign criticizing Zelensky for even negotiating with Putin about the status of the unrecognized republics in eastern Ukraine. And so that is here's what it says here. Putin felt a deja vu. He's constantly being screwed by the Ukrainians. Therefore, they had to be punished. And this does not mean that Zygar approves of this attitude. He's basically communicating Putin's attitude, this feeling that he was promised something, but this was not being delivered. Okay, point next. What do we have here? That Putin. This is actually very interesting. So Zygar talks about Putin's motivations and Russia's motivations for invading Ukraine, and I think the general direction of the book is to basically blame Putin and the Russian society for imperialism, and I'll talk about this in a second. Just really deeply held imperialist feelings, the desire to dominate Ukraine, the desire to control Ukraine. But here's an interesting thing. We've got this little thing here where in 2014, Vladislav Surkov, who was in charge of sort of running Putin's Ukraine program at that time, was given a task, and that's a quote, to turn Donbass into a problem, into a wound that never heals, which would prevent Ukraine's entry into NATO or some other alliance. In other words, if you read this carefully, then it seems that Zygar admits the possibility that one of Putin's motivations for trying to control Ukraine was to prevent Ukraine from sliding towards an alliance or membership in NATO. So that is an interesting point. My personal view on these things is that we cannot have any one cause as the predominant cause. There is a multiplicity of causes. As we know, history is multi-causal, and to say that Putin was just motivated by imperialist desires is to overlook his security concerns. To just talk about his security concerns is to overlook his imperialist ambitions and his irredentism. So I think a multi-causal explanation of why Putin invaded Ukraine is much more convincing. So I think Zygar, it's not quite clear whether he would support my viewpoint, but at least inadvertently he mentioned this in the book, and I thought that this was interesting. Right, the next thing I wanted to talk about in the book is, I already talked about Putin, the Putin feeling that Ukrainians are out to screw him, which is interesting. He also thought, according to Zygar, that the Americans are out to screw him, and there's one interesting example that he mentions on page 206, which would be somewhere here perhaps, where Putin, apparently in the early 2000s, Putin was trying to resolve the problem between Moldova and Transnistria, and according to Zygar, at the last moment the USA insisted that the president of Moldova not sign an agreement with the separatists, according to Dmitry Kozak's plan. This was the guy who was actually doing this, negotiating between the two sides. And for Putin, and this is a quote, this became one of the pieces of evidence that prove that the Americans always have intrigues against Russia. So that is kind of interesting as well. So I thought, all right, what else did I want to talk about? There's some, okay, now let me talk a little bit about some of the problems that I found in this book. The book is a great read, don't get me wrong. I think it's a fantastic read. It's framed around myth. So there are 7 chapters in which basically Zygar tries to debunk myth. So for example, the first myth that he's trying to debunk is the myth of the unity between Russian and Ukrainian people. And there's a myth about Mazeppa's betrayal, there's a myth about Crimea, there's a myth about language, etc., etc. So the book is framed around myth, but I felt that by debunking this myth, Zygar was in fact creating, or at least endorsing, alternative myth. This is what I find really problematic in our discussion of Russian history, Ukrainian history. To my mind, identity is a moving target. Identity constantly evolves. So to say that Russia and Ukraine, or the Russians and Ukrainians are one people, is about, citing some historical facts that go back to the 10th century, is about as ridiculous as to say that they are different people, citing different facts going back to the 10th century. That is because through history, identity evolves. And today's identity, both in Russia and in Ukraine, while rooted in some things in the past, is actually a fairly new identity, something that developed over the last 30 years since the collapse of the USSR. And so asserting some, truthfulness of Ukraine's narrative or over Russian narrative, I think both of those narratives, frankly, as a historian, I can say that both of those narratives about unity of the Russian people or disunity of the Russian and Ukrainian people, both of those narratives are actually quite flawed, fundamentally flawed, methodologically flawed. So I find the whole framing problematic. Another thing that I found problematic with the book is the whole attitude that Zygar has towards Russian cultural elites. In particular, he singles out people like Alexander Pushkin, Iosif Brodsky. Who else is the bad guy here? Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and Fyodor Dostoevsky. I mean, with Solzhenitsyn, for example, he cites something that Solzhenitsyn said back in August 1990, in which he said, Solzhenitsyn, the writer, said, "Today, to separate Ukraine from USSR means to cut across millions of families and peoples, etc., etc., etc." Look, we're talking about August 1990. Ukraine and Russia are still part of the same country. I mean, when I see this, I don't see, he claims here that Solzhenitsyn's statements reveal a similar mindset to today's propaganda of the Russian government. The problem here is that Solzhenitsyn was writing in August 1990 when Ukraine and Russia were part of the same state. So what he said, that the collapse of the USSR entailed separation of families, cutting across families and ties, etc. Is that not true? I mean, is it not? It's ridiculous to deny that. Of course it's true. It is absolutely true. So but even going beyond that, I just generally feel that blaming long dead writers for Putin's decision to invade Ukraine is not a good starting point. I personally find this problematic, and I don't know why he did this. I guess out of great feeling of guilt. And he sort of takes, that's what he does in the book, he takes on this guilt. He feels that, as a Russian, he has to share, as a part of sharing the guilt of the Russian people. Ironically, by the way, and he criticizes Dostoevsky here. The reason he criticizes Dostoevsky, by the way, is he says that Dostoevsky had this idea about Russia as God carrier, народ богоносец, God carrying people. But ironically, even as he criticizes Dostoevsky, the book itself, of course, the title of the book, War and Punishment, is an allusion to Dostoevsky. And what he says here in the conclusion is that the Russians should face up to their imperialism. All of them should face up to it, and then they will. And if they have this punishment, if they accept this punishment today, facing to their horrible crimes as Russians, facing to their imperialism as Russians, then future generations will be free from imperialism. He doesn't quite say what this punishment should entail. It's almost like, like what Dostoevsky's hero or anti-hero Rodion Raskolnikov, certainly hero Rodion Raskolnikov, at the end of the book, of course, goes out into the public square, falls on the ground, kisses the ground, says, "I am guilty." And this is sort of what Zygar does here in this book, saying, "I am guilty, I am part of this nation, I am guilty." He's, of course, aware that there are other empires out there. He's saying, "I'm not speaking about other empires, I'm just speaking about my empire." So this empire of ours, the one that has these cultural figures like Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Brodsky, Solzhenitsyn, this is the source of the evil, this is the source of the problem. I don't know if I agree with this. Okay, so finally a fun bit. Of course, this book is, you can just breathe through this book. It reads wonderfully. The one fun bit that I found that remarkably interesting was the story about how Boris Berezovsky reached out to Viktor Yushchenko, president of Ukraine. And so I will. He reached out because I guess Berezovsky was trying to set himself up in Ukraine in order to effectively have access, buy up some Ukrainian some assets in Ukraine. And then he basically said, so there's a conversation here that Zygar recounts. Berezovsky says, "I will support you." He tells that to Yushchenko. He says, "I will support you in order to fuck Putin." According to some recording, recording that had been made. Well, in this case, answers Yushchenko, let's fuck him together. So I found that very, very interesting. I found also very interesting this little information about Berezovsky investing $50 million into the Orange Revolution, at least according to Zygar. Well, anyway, so with all my disagreement, I found the book super, super interesting, highly commended to you. I think it's certainly one of the most reflective books, self-reflective books written about Russia's war in Ukraine. And I think everybody who knows anything about this war has to read this book. Thank you.